Well, I know none of you are online right now, but there might be. Today, we are streaming video for the first time live from our church worship service. So welcome to our internet audience, and let people know that we are streaming from here on out and would love to have those who can't join us watch online. Also, you may have noticed that other than today, our attendance has been high recently, and so we are hoping to hit 200 on a Sunday that isn't Easter or Christmas. We will need your help to do that. We're just a few people shy of 200 on our largest attendance days, and so if you invite a few extra people to come along and enjoy our worship with you, then we will easily reach 200 before Easter. That is my personal goal. So I hope you will help me in achieving that for our church. Finding your spiritual journey is the pathway to discovering your life and your spirit. It's the doorway to knowing God. We are observers and participants in the changing of thoughts and ideas about life, death, and everything in between. I think that one of the greatest spiritual activities that each of us can do periodically is to literally, on paper, map out our spiritual journey. You can do it in a variety of different ways. You can do it in a chart format with sticky notes on the paper, or even as a collage. Across the bottom of the page, you can write your incremental ages from birth to the present, and then use the axis on the side of the page to mark some spiritual experiences from low to high. And then you begin to fill in those experiences that have formulated your beliefs, both good and bad and everything in between, that has offered you perspective on what it is to be a person of faith. Telling a friend or a spiritual guide or even your spouse the key aspects of the story, of your story, and how you've connected with God or felt alone in the journey is an important part of this mapping of the spiritual journey. It helps us integrate our lives and open ourselves further to the work of God's Spirit. And it also enables us to be more helpful in our relationships and our everyday life. If you haven't done this before and you're interested in looking at some examples, there's a website that is listed in your bulletin, soulshepherding.org. And if you've never done this before, or you're interested in a different way to chart your spiritual life, look for some examples at that website. When you visually map out your spiritual journey on paper, you have a few key parameters, and then the jumbled parts of your life can become more orderly, and the painful parts can experience God's grace. Now, all people have a spiritual path, and this includes, of course, people of faith. It also includes people of every religion, not just Christianity. And I would argue it includes people who are agnostics or atheists, because the spiritual path is an inward process of the joys and the sorrows and the highs and the lows of our souls. And our traditional word for today speaks to this journey of the soul. It's in your bulletin, and it's from the book of James, chapter 1. My brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Let that endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. One of the hardest things about all the twists and the turns of our lives is that it just feels so confusing and disorienting. It may seem that others are perfectly fine where they are on their own spiritual journey, their relationship to church or to God. And at the same time, we can feel unsettled in our own spirits. We can get insecure and we sort of wonder, what's wrong with me that I don't have what they have? In the book, The Critical Journey, Stages in the Life of Faith, Janet Hagberg and Robert Gulick, the spiritual journey is divided into 6 different primary stages. Now, none of these stages are bad or wrong or better than another, and they're printed in your bulletin under the contemporary word, and that's going to be the majority of what I talk about today. The first stage is recognition of God. It's the time when, usually in childhood, we're beginning to believe that there really is something bigger than just ourselves. This process starts when we're very young, and we may revisit these steps as we age. It's this continual awakening within us that life is about more than self, and that purpose and meaning come through relationship. I loved watching our children go through these stages. This awakening of self and God and another was so fresh and new to them. And I know all of you who have had children or know children, nieces and nephews or grandchildren, will know what I'm talking about. Our son Adam, who was 4 at the time, staving off this cough, he tried to comfort me at the death of a family member. He was 4 years old. And as we were literally leaving the cemetery that day, he asked, "Mom, did you see Jesus there?" "No," I said. "Did you see Jesus?" I asked him. "Well, yes, Mom, he was across the field from the cemetery. He was wearing jeans, and he was walking on his way out of the cemetery on his way to heaven." Adam clearly saw with eyes that I didn't have, and he described from the pureness of his heart a scene that was profoundly healing to all of us who were adults who had gathered there that day. The stage in the journey is a life of discipleship. It's learning more about God. And for many, this occurs in our families and our churches, but it also happens in places you don't expect. We learn all kinds of things on the school playground, including a spectrum from about the birds and the bees to God. How many times have you heard, or perhaps it happened to you on the playground, that somebody told you the facts of life? My mother remembers a time when she heard for the first time about the birds and the bees on the playground, and she ran out of the field screaming, "My parents would never do that." Okay, I thought it was funny. We learn about God on the school playground too, and this is the part of the life of discipleship. We learn the good, bad, and the ugly about faith, about God, religion, and the church, and we start to sort out what we believe and what we don't believe. Again, we can return to this stage many different times in our lives as life experience and observations begin to change what we believe. There was once a child who was listening, or a parent who was listening to his child saying his nighttime prayers, and the child began his prayer with, "Dear Howard." The father looked at him and finally asked at the end of the prayer, "Why did you call God Howard?" "Well, Dad, I've been doing this for a number of years," he said. "Don't you think I should be able to call God by his first name?" And the dad was a little befuddled, and he said, "Well, yes, but where did you get the idea that God's first name was Howard?" And the child said, "We say the prayer every week, Dad. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed is your name." Stage 2 is when we learn God's name. Stage 3 is the productive life. It's when we serve and we do things for God. For many of us, this is the stage we enjoy most of our adult lives. In fact, the majority of Christians live their entire faith journey in stages 1 to 3. But then we hit, and most all of us do at least once, the wall. Things stop working in our belief system for one reason or another. And what happens to a lot of people is somewhere along the road, they hit the wall and they lose faith. This can be a personal crisis, a faith crisis, anything that causes the productive life to stop working. Most of us hit that wall, and some of us slam into it a little more dramatically. All we know is that what once worked for us no longer does. We don't feel satisfied or safe or energized in the system we used to give our heart and our time to. The way we used to experience God just doesn't move us anymore. The way we have more questions and answers. We allow ourselves to feel pain and let God come into places we didn't want to before. Sometimes we leave our faith, bleeding and wounded and wondering if we'll ever be whole again. It's a very confusing time, but it can also be the most glorious, because it's where we begin to let go of some of the comforts that protected us so well, but kept us from a deeper, a richer, a more mysterious spiritual experience. The bad news is that many people are taught and trained to dance around this wall and to stay in stage 3, or to get back there as fast as they can. The goal the church often teaches is get back to normal as quickly as you can, and far fewer people actually do the hard, courageous work of going through the wall, because it requires entering into stage 4, which is a scary place where it feels like everything we believe is up for grabs. Stage 4 is the journey inward. It's figuring out a new way to do a relationship with what is holy, with ourselves and with others. Stage 4 is where we need good guidance, fellow sojourners who will stay with us and remind us that the spiritual work is critical for life. They remind us to listen deeply and not lose hope when what we once knew for sure has been stripped away. Stage 5 is the journey outward. It's a time where we learn to live and serve and love from a totally different place. And the hope is that we'll transition into stage 5, where we are serving and loving and living from a new, free place that gives life not only to us, but to others around us. In this journey outward, we begin to live from a place where we serve others. We're more vulnerable, not only to ourselves, but also to the holy. And we're deeply committed to community. We begin living at a little bit slower pace. And we begin to love and to serve other people out of a deep desire and passion instead of the duty and obligation that was in stage 3. We don't serve out of some sort of attachment to an organization or institution like the church, but rather we want to give of ourselves because of what is in us. Stage 5 brings with it a greater sense of freedom, compassion, and depth, and a willingness to not know the answers to everything in life. If you're there with me, I won't ask you to raise your hands. But those in stage 5 learn not to have all the answers. Stage 6 is the life of love. And it's so poured out. It's beyond stage 5. It's so poured out that it's kind of wild. This stage describes some well-known people, including saints of the church. Stage 6 is evidenced by people who love so dramatically that they risk seeming a bit crazy. Think of Mother Teresa, willing to live in Calcutta and risking her very life. Think of Oscar Romero and becoming an advocate for the poor while shaking up the powerful people in the congregation to the point that someone murdered him at the communion table. That's the kind of pouring out of life and love that stage 6 involves. Now, these steps are not a formula. You can move between the steps and revisit them throughout your life. Because, as you know, the spiritual life isn't a continuum where you start at one place and you finish at the opposite end. There are all kinds of twists and turns and moments of, frankly, nothingness. There are peaks and there are valleys and great times of angst. Thomas Merton said, "Living is the constant adjustment of thought to life and life to thought in such a way that we are always growing, always experiencing new things in the old and old things in the new. Thus, our lives are always new." Now, the wall that I talked about is real. The spiritual journey to the inside is worth it. The healing, the freedom, the love that springs forth from all that hard work of the soul is beautiful and worthwhile. Our spiritual walk is long and wild and important, and at many times it is impossibly slow. There's no doubt that we need patient, safe, and challenging people to remind us that what is holy is big and alive and present with us, even in the darkest and loneliest of days. I would urge you, if you haven't, this week to sit down and look at soul shepherding, or just take a moment to pinpoint some of the highs and the lows of your spiritual life, and then talk about it with a trusted friend, a spouse, or Paul or me. We would love to hear about the journey of your soul, inward, outward, up, down, the wild days, the days of love. For these make you the person you are. Thanks be to God.